If you take the microbiome from anxious humans, the mice will develop behavioral issues which will look like anxiety.
So, Professor Colin Hill, welcome to Stress Free Longevity. I think always a good place to start, if you don't mind. It's just a quick introduction. Do you mind just letting our listeners know where you are in the world and what your key interests are?
Yeah, I'm an academic. I'm a microbiologist based here in University College Cork, which is in south of Ireland, right down the southern tip. And I've been here doing research and teaching for the last 30 years. And what we do in Cork a lot is we work on the microbiome and on probiotics and prebiotics and postbiotics and things like that, which I think are going to be the topic of this conversation.
They are indeed. Any financial disclosures you wish to make?
We do work with industry. We do research for industry, but nothing that I think compromises any of my views. These will be my personal views that I would express here, not any kind of endorsed views by any company.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, like you said, probably the primary purpose of today is very much postbiotics, prebiotics, and probiotics. And by extension, the microbiome. We always like to start with a little bit of science because there will be people listening who are very unfamiliar with those terms. So let's start with some basic science. What exactly is a probiotic?
A probiotic is any live microbe that can confer a health benefit on the host. And that's really as simple as it is. We've known for 100 years, actually only about 100 years, that bacteria, microbes, viruses can cause disease. And before that, we didn't know the germ theory of disease, that we've realized that bacteria can affect our health negatively. And I suppose only in the last, really, with some good science behind it, it's only the last 20 or 30 years we begin to realize that microbes can also be beneficial for our health. And one way of delivering health benefits is through probiotics.
Now, you hear a lot about good bacteria and bad bacteria. So, what makes a good bacteria, a good probiotic?
Well, it's in the action. I mean, obviously, bacteria are neither good nor bad. It's our perspective on them. A bacteria that degrades food material and rots food, we would regard as bad if that food is in our fridge, and we think it's great when that food is in a landfill and we want it to be broken down. So the same bacteria can be both good and bad. A good bacterium is one that works essentially with us. We evolved into a microbial world. We're only here a few 100,000 years. Micro's been here for billions of years. So it's a microbial world and we inhabit it. And with many of those microbes, we've essentially established a relationship, a positive relationship where they help us to maintain our health, digest our food, and so on. And we support them by eating and feeding them. There are some bacteria, which of course are, you'll be very familiar with them, are infectious, which cause disease, salmonella, and these can also be consumed in our food and they cause disease. So good bacteria, bad bacteria, I would say a bad bacterium is one that causes disease and a good bacterium is virtually everything else.
In terms of our microbiome, how many strains are we talking about in the gut? Is it tens, hundreds, thousands, or are we discovering more and more all the time?
Here we get into a little bit of semantics. When you say strain, every strain of bacteria is almost different. I might have an E. coli in my gut, and you have an E. coli in your gut, but they're not the same. They're different strains made of different properties, different characteristics. They share a lot. That's why we give them the same name. But they can be different in very essential components of their genomes and therefore what they can do. In terms of strains, we have thousands in our guts. In terms of like species, which is a higher level of taxonomy, we have hundreds, maybe even again touching towards thousands. But the curious thing about the microbiome is it's different in every single person. So if we're both healthy, your liver and my liver will be made up of essentially the same types of cells doing the same types of things. Your microbiome and my microbiome are completely different. We may share some species and genera, but at a strain level, they're all different. But yet they have to perform the same kind of functions. So there's a lot more redundancy in the microbiome. I might have an E. coli doing something for me, which is very important for my health, and you might have a Bacteroides doing that same thing for you, which is very important for your health. So that makes it a difficult area to get a really easy handle on. But essentially, my colleague, Fergus Shannon, who was a gastroenterologist here, has coined the term that your microbiome is like a virtual organ. It's the same weight and size as an organ, as a liver or a brain, but it's an organ that is acquired after birth, not before birth. It's not genetically encoded in us. We acquire it as a result of our lifestyles and our environments. But once you acquire it, it's yours, and it's pretty stable then for the rest of your life. So it's an odd concept. It's an organ, a microbial organ in a human body, which performs functions that are essential for human life, but are different in every individual. And yet, at some kind of functional level, they're probably pretty similar in every individual, if that makes sense.
Are there any species or strains that are particularly good? That would be the kind of superstar species that we need to know about, or is variety
Yeah, there's
more important?
diversity is very important in any ecosystem that we can think of, whether it's the jungle or any kind of natural ecosystem. Normally, diversity is a property that we really like. We like to see lots of different things. That makes the environment and the ecosystem more resilient to change, more adaptable to change. If you have an ecosystem which is, dominated by one species, then that's very vulnerable to change. And so we generally believe that a diverse microbiome is the best. There are some species which are getting a lot of attention as being health promoting. Bifidobacterium is a bacteria that people may have heard of because it's used as a probiotic a lot, and it's really important in infants soon after birth. Most infants' microbiomes are dominated by bifidobacteria, and that's a very good thing. So they're generally seen as a positive species, but they dwindle a bit as we get older and they become less important as part of our microbiome. So there are a few guys sticking their heads up, getting more research attention as good guys, but they've long, complicated Latin names. I just don't want to throw out a whole list of them here.
I'm thinking about the other extreme of life because part of this podcast is longevity and maintaining health and into the later years. Any strains that have, longevity benefits, or is it really just about maintaining a healthy, diverse microbiome into older age?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many confounders. As we get older, we tend to maybe exercise less. Your diet becomes less diverse. You get into habits of what you eat, maybe. You might be on medication. You might be suffering from different diseases. You may be um, confined geographically to a more restricted area. And all these things will feed into what your microbiome looks like. And so the microbiome does get less diverse and a little bit more fragile as we get older. But is that because we're getting older, or is it causing us to age a little bit faster? Colleagues of mine here in UCC, in mice, no, not in humans, have done microbiome transplants from young mice to older mice. And they've actually been able to prevent some of the things that we associate with aging, like loss of cognition and things like that. You can actually prevent them with this transfer from a younger mouse. So that's really exciting, giving us a sense that maybe there's a causal role for the microbiome in some of the things that we associate with aging, and not just a result of aging. Because that's the big thing that has not stymied, but puzzled microbiome scientists for years is the microbiome different because you have a disease, or is a different microbiome leading to the disease? Cause or consequence? That's a difficult thing to unravel in complex human populations.
And then what is a prebiotic?
Well, as I said, a probiotic is a live microbe that you deliver into the gut in very high numbers because you think, or you've shown, or you've proven in a clinical trial that that confers a benefit on the host. But another option is to deliberately expand a beneficial microbe that's already in your gut. So what if you could take a food that is aimed at a particular member of the gut microbiota that will then expand because you're essentially feeding it at the expense of the neighboring bacteria, and therefore deliver a health benefit in that way. So you're taking advantage of the fact that these beneficial bacteria are already there, but you want to kind of selectively promote the growth of certain ones. So a prebiotic, the definition again is a substrate that is selectively used by members of the microbiome that confers a health benefit. So for both probiotic and prebiotic, they both end in that confers a health benefit. And that must be proven. That can't just be, I think it does, or I've fed this prebiotic to people and they tell me they feel better. That's not a health benefit. It has to be a measurable, demonstrable health benefit.
And why does any of this matter? Can you paint a picture of what a healthy microbiome actually does for our health and wellness, and even how it works?
Maybe the most extreme example of showing why a microbiome is important is we can generate germ-free animals. Mice, for example, or rats, or even pigs in some extremes, which have no microbes at all. They're completely sterile, and you can leave them living in a completely sterile environment. And they do exhibit health defects that are a result of not having access to microbes. Their immune systems don't develop properly. Even cognitively, they can not be as well developed. Certainly, digestion is significantly affected. So, in a very extreme case, we can see we need a microbiome to function properly. One of the main things the microbiome does for us is helps us to digest our food. There are many things in our foods that we as humans can't digest, but the microbes can. And then they can break them down into things that we can digest. And it's estimated that we would have to consume, about 50% more food if we didn't have microbes just to maintain our body weight. And unfortunately, of course, we've reached a point in human history where, or fortunately maybe, where we have more food than we need. Most people do. And people would love to be able to eat more food and not put on weight. That's kind of almost the holy grail now of nutrition is, can we design foods that people can eat and yet not put on weight? But obviously throughout human history, with limited access to food, we needed to convert that into as much energy as possible. So the microbiome helps us to digest food. You can even see for example, mother's milk. Mother's milk contains lots of sugars, human milk oligosaccharides, they're normally called. And maybe, 20% of the sugar in mother's milk is made up of these human milk oligosaccharides that the baby can't use. The baby cannot digest them. And think, why has evolution got us to a point where a mother is putting a lot of energy into making sugars that her baby can't digest? And the reason, we believe, is the mother is already priming the microbiome, is deliberately feeding the microbiome to develop a strong, healthy microbiome to help the baby develop properly. So that gives us a sense of how important these microbes are, that we've been evolutionarily designed to make sure they're there and that they're properly fed, even in newborn babies. One area where the microbiome has proven to be very important, and it's an area that has really excited scientists, and it was perhaps a little bit unexpected, is the area of microbiome transplants. I talked already about maybe transplanting the microbiome from young mice into older mice and dealing with some of the consequences of aging. But there was a famous experiment done 20 years ago now that really triggered the whole microbiome area, which is when people could show that if you took the microbiome from people with a condition and transferred it into germ-free animals, animals that did not have a microbiome, the animals would then go ahead and develop that condition. So as an example, Jeffrey Gordon in the US, he took the microbiome from twins, identical twins who are identical in every respect except one was obese and one was lean. So these twins have the same genetics, the same background, but one is obese and one is lean. He took the microbiomes from each of these twins and put them into germ-free mice. And the germ-free mice that got the obese twins microbiome became obese. Germ-free mice that got the lean twins microbiome stayed lean. And they were on the exact same diet, these mice. And that was fascinating, the idea that two different microbiomes might have completely different energy harvesting capabilities, which would lead to a phenotype change in the human. And since then, it's been shown that if you take, for example, the microbiome from people with inflammatory bowel disease, the animals will develop some of the symptoms of inflammatory bowel disease. If you take the microbiome from anxious humans, the mice will develop behavioral issues which will look like anxiety. So there is some evidence there, quite compelling evidence, that the microbiome can really affect us and our health. And I think that's really fascinating. But which microbes are doing it and why and how and can we manipulate that? That's the real challenge for microbiome science.
And how do you think that is being communicated to the body? It's obviously not just solely through the breakdown of food. The bacteria must be communicating to the body in some way. On a basic level, what do you
Well,
think is happening there?
again, if you remember that we evolved into a microbial world, and as we evolved, and all animals and plants, we didn't essentially reinvent the wheel. We took advantage of things microbes already did. So we have brain chemicals that you will be familiar with: acetylcholine, serotonin, GABA. These are neurotransmitters that transmit signals in the brain. But bacteria make all of those. And it's, of course, because when we were looking for a chemical to use as a neurotransmitter, we said, let's take something that's already there and repurpose it for our purposes. But what that means, of course, we speak the exact same language as microbes. We produce chemicals, they produce chemicals, we produce the same chemicals. And so there's evidence that microbes in the gut are actually communicating directly with our brain through these neurotransmitters and other chemicals. They're obviously communicating with our immune system, they're communicating with our enteric nervous system, and they're producing things that our epithelial cells are using. So there's just a constant conversation back and forth between this virtual organ that we have in our gut and the human body itself. So, the language is the exact same.
So, what are the main factors that influence our gut microbiome?
Diet is obviously crucial because we feed our microbes and they're dependent on us to feed them. And so, very different diets will lead to very different microbiomes over a long period of time. Our genetics certainly informs our microbiomes, our living environments, whether we live with animals or not, exercise, lots of different things. These are all confounders and factors, what medication you're on. All of these things end up shaping your microbiome. I sometimes just say you have the microbiome you deserve. As a result of all the things you do in your life and the conditions in which you live, that's what shapes your microbiome. So you have your own microbiome and you have shaped it and you have the one you deserve now. Obviously, you can only have microbes in your gut that you have encountered in your life. You can't get them from, they don't just appear out of nowhere. And so your microbiome is very much shaped by your environment as to what's there or who's there. But then the kind of balance of those and the structure of your microbiome is very much influenced by internal factors as well. We produce antimicrobial peptides that kill things in the gut. We produce a lot of mucus. Now, the mucus performs a number of functions. Obviously, it helps our diet pass through the gut and so on, but the mucus is food for bacteria as well. So a lot of bacteria will be influenced by what type of mucus is being produced. Our immune system, we can raise antibodies against a microbe and then eliminate it through antibodies and macrophage attack, or we can tolerate a microbe and leave it there. So we have a big influence on which microbes are present and their kind of relative abundances to each other.
How has modern life changed our microbiomes compared to our ancestors?
Dramatically. But whether that's a good or a bad thing, I would put a little kind of pin in that for a second. But if you look at, and people have looked at the microbiomes of hunter-gatherers in South America and in Africa who hadn't had much contact with civilization, and they have very different microbiomes to us. But of course, their diet is completely different, their environment is completely different. So, we sometimes think, oh, we're missing microbes that we used to have, and we have microbes that we didn't used to have. And that's, you can kind of make the 2 + 2 conclusion that's a bad thing. But it may be that we have the microbes now that are perfectly adapted to our modern lifestyles, and that the ancient microbiome wouldn't do the job properly for us. Or it may be that we would be much healthier if we had that ancient microbiome. So it's definitely changed, but whether that's a good or bad thing, I think is still open to debate.
And presumably, compared to our ancestors, we live in a much cleaner, more sanitized world. Is that potentially hurting our microbiomes as well?
Again, it's certainly a factor in shaping our microbiomes. Now, has it hurt our microbiomes? I don't know. I think our microbiomes have adapted to this cleaner environment. Obviously, the benefits of living in a clear environment are enormous and would outweigh any impact, I think, on your microbiome. The fact that we live into our hopefully 80s and 90s now and don't die of infectious disease, the fact that, most children make it to adulthood now, that people can live with a range of different diseases that couldn't have lived with in the past. All these things are a testament to modern science and modern medicine, and we wouldn't give those up for anything. So I don't subscribe to the kind of eat dirt, you know, idea that, oh, we're too clean, we should get dirty again. And there were lots of consequences to being dirty and to living in unsanitary environments. So being more sanitary has had an enormous positive impact on human health, and I would not reverse that. Has it had an impact on our microbiomes? Certainly. It's also maybe had an impact on some chronic diseases. We have far more chronic diseases like diabetes and IBD and metabolic syndrome, different diseases like that than we used to have. Sometimes people link that to the hygiene hypothesis by less exposure to microbes. Our immune systems are almost turning on ourselves and creating autoimmune diseases. Yeah, that's possible. So there might be some intermediate place where we can make sure we're exposed to lots of microbes, but that they're safe microbes. But just simply going out and rolling the dirt is not a way of overcoming the issues associated with good sanitation.
Is it possible to lose entire species or strains of bacteria over time, or do the concentrations just go down, but they're still kind of present?
It's a good question, and it comes back to how we detect these bacteria. I didn't say anything about that. I mean, normally what we do, the most simple thing for us to do is to take a fecal sample from someone. We're talking here now about the gut microbiome, that we also have a skin microbiome and a lung microbiome and a urogenital microbiome and so on. But the gut microbiome, we take a fecal sample, we smash it up, and we sequence it. We sequence all of the DNA in that sample. And most of that DNA comes from microbes. And by reading that DNA, we can match it back to the microbe. So we can say, okay, you're dominated by this microbe, you've some of this, and we say, but there's a limit to that. We can only detect the more abundant ones. So if something's there at a very, very low level, it'll essentially vanish from our sight and we won't be able to see it. Unless, of course, it grows back up once conditions have changed. So we do see microbes kind of disappear and we see what look like new microbes appearing. And in some cases, it may be just they dropped below the level of detection and came back. But certainly you can see the loss of species from microbiomes. That does happen.
Well, let's go on to just talk about some of the kind of practical advice around this. We will come to supplementation shortly, but let's start with natural sources of pre and probiotics. Let's start with probiotics. What are the best dietary sources?
Here now again, I have to unfortunately make a bit of a distinction that a probiotic, formally by definition, is a strain of bacteria or yeast that has been shown to deliver a health benefit in a properly controlled trial. That's a probiotic. There may be bacteria in food that are good for you and benefit your health, but we wouldn't call them probiotics because they haven't demonstrated that level of efficacy. So when we talk about probiotics, probiotics are bacteria into which a lot of research has been put and a health benefit has been demonstrated. Foods contain lots of live microbes, which could be very good for us. But again, just formally, we wouldn't call them probiotics. So when you say what's a good source of probiotics, unfortunately, the only source of probiotics is industry. Industries that have gone to the trouble of doing those clinical trials, proven that there's a health benefit, and are now selling those strains as probiotics. Everything else is just live microbes in food. So fermented foods contain a lot of live microbes. I believe, and lots of people believe, that those live microbes can also have a health benefit, but it just hasn't been formally demonstrated, so we don't call them probiotics.
So that's extremely interesting. Now, in terms of the community of expertise in the microbiome community, what are some of the foods that maybe don't have the scientific evidence for health benefits, but are potentially beneficial for health?
Yeah, I mean, I often think, it would be extraordinary if we discovered the microbiome and then we turned all the nutritional and dietetic evidence for the last hundreds of years on its head and said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Chocolate is good for you because it helps your microbiome, and vegetables are not good for you." No, none of that happened. Obviously, what's good for your microbiome are the things that we already know. Um, that Michael Pollan, I think, is the one who's credited with saying, "Eat less, mostly plants." That's the kind of dietary advice, the Mediterranean diet, the idea that you eat more fruit and vegetables, less processed food, less meat. Yeah, that holds true for the microbiome, because the microbiome is part of us, and it would have been very odd if the microbiome had a completely different nutritional requirement to the rest of us. So all the standard advice of get exercise, eat responsibly, eat a diverse diet, stay away from, processed sugars and alcohol and overly depend on meat diets. All of that holds true for the microbiome as well. A colleague of mine here, Jens Walter, has spent a lot of time studying this, and he's come up with something called the NIME diet. You can look it up online, NIME. And this is kind of trying to go back to a more vegetable-based diet, root vegetables. He's come up with a whole series of recipes and things, and he has shown that this has a positive influence on your microbiome, or at least it seems to promote the growth of microbes that we think are beneficial in the microbiome. And it's based kind of on Papua New Guinea, where the natives had very few of these chronic diseases we talked about, and have a very plant-based diet and have very different microbiomes from us. So it's an attempt to kind of almost restore a more ancient microbiome and the health benefits that might go along with that.
So clearly, there's been some increased interest in the microbiome over the last 5, 10 years, and you see that in our dietary choices as well. You see a lot of kefir now in in the supermarkets when maybe 5 or 10 years ago that wasn't a thing. Anything about those kind of probiotic type foods, your sauerkrauts, kimchi, your fermented type foods, is there merit in that, or is that again marketing hype?
I think there is. We did a study over the last couple of years together with American colleagues. They do something in America called the NHANES, where they take about 50,000 people and get them to fill in very, very precise food questionnaires, what they've been eating. Also, they measure their kind of health and BMIs and all these kind of factors around them. And they've published that. And so what we could do, we went back into that, and there are about 50,000 foods listed in that, I think. And we assigned every one of them a microbial value. We said if it's a fermented food, it's got high levels of microbes. If it's a raw vegetable or a raw fruit, it's got medium levels. And if it's been cooked or processed, it's got none. And what we did was when I say we did, it was statisticians did it. We kind of matched, do people who eat high levels of live microbes have better health overall than people who eat low levels? And the answer was yes, they do. And that's been replicated now in Korea and in a few other places where they have very detailed dietary histories of large numbers of people. You can see that people who eat more live microbes have better health outcomes than people who don't. Now, I should point out, of course, there are confounders there. Probably eating more fermented vegetables or more fermented dairy and fermented foods might mean you're in a slightly higher socioeconomic level, which might mean you've better health care, which might be, there's confounders. We can't just go, okay, so obviously live microbes equals better health. But the evidence it looks pretty compelling. And I think we evolved, again, as humans, probably to expect large numbers of microbes in our diet, because obviously on until very recently, every food we ate would have contained large numbers of microbes. And maybe, fermented foods is a way of continuing that, delivering on that expectation to our immune systems and our microbiomes of high numbers of live microbes. So I do believe that things like kimchi, kombucha, yogurts, aged cheeses, fermented meats, fermented pickles, fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, all these things with very high levels of microbes are probably beneficial in and of themselves anyway, nutritionally. But I think there is that added factor if they deliver a lot of live microbes, and that is beneficial to our health. That's my take on that.
So again, within the microbiome community, are there any other kind of superstar food groups or specific foods themselves that perhaps confer some additional benefits?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, again, we're back to the kind of whole probiotic and prebiotic divide. The probiotics are delivering live microbes into the gut that might have a health benefit or that will have a health benefit, while prebiotics are feeding existing members of the gut microbiome. And so with food, we can look at that in the same kind of light. We've already talked about fermented foods, foods with very high levels of microbes. So you're delivering new microbes into the gut, and that could have a health benefit. The other type of food that's very beneficial is high fiber foods, foods which selectively promote the growth of good bacteria in the gut. I'm talking here about things like root vegetables, dates, figs, those kind of high fiber foods that deliver a nutritional jolt, of course, to the body and are good for that, but are complex, take a bit of digestion. And sometimes that can cause people problems, it can cause a bit of bloating or flatulence or something. People, if they suddenly go on a very high fiber diet from a less high fiber diet. Um, so there may be a bit of teething problems as your microbes begin to adapt to this new higher fiber, but you'll get past that. And I think if I was designing a diet from scratch, and obviously dietitians and nutritionists would design it in terms of the micronutrients and vitamins and, you know, fats versus sugars versus whatever, I would be including fermented foods, both for the high levels of bacteria that are in there already and some of those microbial products, some of the acids and vitamins that the microbes make when they ferment a food, and then couple that with high fiber foods to feed your existing microbiome to keep that in a good order, if you like. Root vegetables are very important, but also I think things like figs and dates and high fiber foods like that.
What are some of the foods that maybe negatively influence the microbiome? What should people maybe try to cut back on?
You know, again, it'd be extraordinary if the microbiome threw out things that were contrary to typical dietary advice. But simple sugars, they don't really have much of an impact on the microbiome because they're absorbed higher up in the GI tract and they're absorbed very quickly. So if you eat simple sugars, they're kind of gone almost instantly into the body. And, if you need energy, you need simple sugars. But if you were eating too much, then those simple sugars get converted to fat and we get problems with obesity and so on. Um, can't think really of any foods that have been shown to really have a negative impact on the microbiome. A bad diet overall, a narrow, less diverse diet, if somebody is existing on, cereals and pizza, they're going to have a microbiome that will reflect that. Once again, you have the microbiome you deserve, just like you probably have the body weight that you deserve based on your exercise levels and intake and so on. So I don't think there's anything specific that I know of that causes damage to the microbiome. No food group that I know of.
There's always this kind of concern around modern food processing and industrialized food processing. And one example that comes to mind is the use of antibiotics in meat production. Anything you would like to say around modern industrial farming and food processing that maybe has an impact on our microbiomes?
Yeah, in most developed countries now, we don't have to worry about antibiotics being used in farming and then coming through the food chain and into us. That's been essentially eliminated. And levels of antibiotics coming through that route would be tiny. I mean, the issue there is more, antimicrobial resistance, developing antimicrobial resistant pathogens rather than a direct impact on our microbiome. Obviously, if you take antibiotics, particularly oral antibiotics, that will affect your microbiome, but that's completely outweighed by the benefits of taking the antibiotics because you need them and you've been prescribed them by a clinician. So I would never avoid antibiotics when they're prescribed to protect your microbiome because you have more important things to worry about and your microbiome will rebound. So I wouldn't worry about that at all in terms of antibiotic treatment.
Just in terms of antibiotic treatment, would you have any advice around how to negate the impact of the antibiotic? I presume pre-antibiotic use having a good healthy diet, and then similarly post. Would you do anything differently? Would you use supplements? We're going to come to supplements shortly, but would you do anything differently, or just try to maintain good healthy diet pre and post the use of the antibiotics?
Certainly that's really important. Sometimes when people take antibiotics, they get diarrhea, antibiotic-associated diarrhea, or they get stomach upsets as a result. And that's because the microbiome has been temporarily damaged. And there are some probiotics which have been shown to reduce the length of time of that. So instead of maybe having diarrhea for 3 days, you'll have it for 2 days or only 1 day. May not prevent the initial damage to the microbiome, but it can help you to recover more quickly. So if you're someone who does get stomach upsets and diarrhea following antibiotics, then that could be a strategy. Many people do not get diarrhea following antibiotics and therefore probably don't need to do anything specific.
How quickly can the microbiome be affected by dietary change? Are we talking, if I was to transform my diet today, would I see a benefit in days, weeks, months, years? It's not a simple answer, but what would be your response to that?
You begin to see a response in days and certainly within weeks. What I maybe again hesitate a little bit is the beneficial response. You will see a response back to you have the microbiome you deserve. If you change your diet, your microbiome will change to accommodate that new diet. Whether that's a benefit to you or not, we'd have to see, later on by doing proper testing and what health benefit were you trying to achieve by doing that. And so you could measure that specifically. But it certainly will change within days or certainly within weeks.
So let's move on to supplementation. Now, we did talk recently with Joanne Manson on supplements, different types of supplements, obviously vitamins and other dietary type supplements. The kind of overarching message was that natural is probably best. Supplements are probably beneficial for those with proven deficits or deficiencies in certain nutrients. Is that the same for pre and postbiotics? What role does supplementation play? Is this something everyone should consider, or only in certain kind of subgroups of people?
Yeah, it's like Fergus Shanahan again. I always describe this to him anyway. He always said, as a clinician, people would say to him, "Do probiotics work?" And he would respond, "Well, what if I ask you, do pills work?" How would you answer that? I mean, as a clinician yourself, you would probably answer that by, "Well, what pills and for what condition? What are you asking me here?" That's too generic a question. So when you ask, do supplements work? I would say, well, which supplements and for which condition? Because for some supplements, for some conditions, there's really good evidence. For others, it's a bit more marketing and, word of mouth and maybe observational studies, but not as good a direct evidence. So it's not a very satisfying answer for a consumer or for someone listening to this saying, look, I just want you to tell me, should I be taking a probiotic and which one? I would have to say, well, what do you want to achieve? And, how much you're willing to spend to achieve that. And then a supplement may be the solution for you. But if you're just trying to maintain good health, you're in good health, you want to maintain good health, and you're looking to ingest lots of live bacteria, I'd say go for fermented foods or go for, you know, a cheap supplement that has lots of microbes in it. But if you have IBS or you've got asthma or you've got some specific condition and you're saying, I'd like to take a probiotic or prebiotic supplement to help me with this condition, then unfortunately the answer is, well, then go and do the research. Go and find out. Your clinician, your GP may not have this information because it's not part of medical training. It may be more a dietitian that would have this kind of information, or you may have to do the legwork yourself. But go and find out what is the probiotic with the best level of evidence for this condition, and then where can I get it and how much does it cost, and try it and see if it benefits you. And if it does, weigh the cost against the benefit and so on. So it's not an easy answer. It's not just, yeah, I would recommend supplements. You'd have to know a lot more about what somebody was taking them for.
Are probiotics useful on their own, or do you need a prebiotic? Presumably, you can put all the amount of probiotics in there, but unless you're feeding them, presumably they won't take root. Do you think they need to be considered together as a whole, or does that make sense?
It does. And what's kind of counterintuitive about probiotics. You're putting live bacteria into the gut, but they generally don't survive very long. They generally just almost pass straight through. They're not being delivered to become part of your microbiome. They're there as a kind of an extra. And in some parts of your gut, they will be the dominant bacteria for a very short period of time after you've eaten them. And that may have a direct effect on your immune system, your nervous system, your gut barrier function, things like that. But then they'll pass through. So that's why you have to keep taking them, which of course is good for the people who make them because it means you have to take them every day. But the objective is not to insert them into your microbiome and have them become part of your microbiome. Your microbiome that you've selected over many years is actually pretty hostile to incomers. It doesn't really want to change, and it has kind of occupied all of the ecological niches in the gut, and it will do its best to resist incoming new microbes. So most probiotics, you eat them, they're there, and then they're gone again. And you have to keep eating them to get those benefits. So ingesting like a high fiber food with your probiotic is not going to support your probiotic. It's going to support members of your microbiome, which could also be a good thing. In fact, it might even help your microbiome to better fight off the probiotic because it would be in a healthier state. So it's a bit of a paradox there that both things are good for you, but they don't necessarily interact. Now, some companies have tried to develop probiotics together with a prebiotic, which is almost designed for that specific probiotic. They call them synbiotics, and it's a synergy between a probiotic and a prebiotic that feeds it at the same time. But for most probiotics, they just pass through very quickly, have an effect, but then are gone again.
Are there any risks to supplementation? Inherently, you think of them as being healthy, but as we discovered in other episodes, supplements come with risks as well. Too much of anything is probably not great. Anything we should know? Any people who should avoid pre and postbiotic supplementation? Anything to consider around the risks of supplementation?
There are always risks, I guess, with a manufactured product. A very dramatic example, one that was a horrible example, is premature infants born in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit, can very often develop a condition called NEC, necrotizing enterocolitis, and that can be fatal, unfortunately. And what was shown in the US in a number of trials was that giving those babies, those really premature babies, probiotics has a very significant effect and actually reduces morbidity and mortality in these very vulnerable infants. So that's amazing. It's a great example of probiotics working. But then, unfortunately, a baby died of a mold infection, and it turned out that the mold was present in the supplement that was being given, that there was a breakdown in manufacturing practice. So there's that kind of risk. Now, the risk wasn't associated with the probiotic per se, but it was associated with the manufacturing, giving these very vulnerable babies a mold. And so, in fact, the Food and Drug Administration has paused the use of probiotics in the NICU, even though it's been shown to have a really good benefit because of that manufacturing issue. So there's that kind of risk. If something's made badly, then of course it could carry a problem. But I don't think there's any risk of overdosing. You have probably 10 to the 14 microbes in your body, one with 14 zeros after it. A probiotic is, 0.00001% of that. And so the chances of it somehow kind of being an overdose and causing a problem is minimal. Obviously, if someone by mistake packaged the wrong bacteria, a dangerous bacterium or something like that, that could be a problem. But that's, you know, that risk is associated with everything you eat, that if somebody has done something bad, then you could suffer a consequence. So I don't think there's any possibility of overdosing on the probiotic itself. But a supplement is a manufactured thing, and therefore things can go wrong in manufacturing. We need to be aware of that.
So, thinking about choosing a supplement, you mentioned before, and I think I'll repeat it again, if you have a specific condition, do some research. There may be specific choices there. But for the person who's listening who knows they're not getting enough in their diet and wants to supplement for some health benefits, what should people look for? How do they make the right choice? For example, in terms of species, strain, dosing, even the product itself, who's manufactured it, etc. What sort of things should people consider when making a choice?
This is a tough one. I don't want to recommend any specific products, but it depends on people's circumstance. If somebody is low income and they're struggling to buy sufficient food to feed themselves or their families, I would not recommend paying significant euros to buy, a supplement. I would go for something cheap. If economics isn't an issue, I would say go with the big players, the big industry players, because their reputations are precious to them. And, the local company that says, "Oh, we make a probiotic just down the road, and it's the local probiotic," and they may not have the evidence to support the health benefit. But if I was looking for just I'm healthy, I don't have a specific condition I want to treat, but I would like to take more microbes in my diet, and I don't want to do that through fermented foods, I would look for a diverse. Some probiotics have like 7 or 8 different microbes in them, and they're high numbers and they're relatively cheap. Probably because the research hasn't been done to back them up. That's just a fact. If you put the very expensive research into proving a probiotic works, you then have to charge more for the probiotic to get that money back. So that's just, economics. But if your health is good and you're thinking, I wouldn't mind having more microbes in my diet, I just look on the shelf for high numbers, and that's, at least 10 to the 9. That's a billion per dose, and with a variety of different microbes in there. Very often they contain things like bifidobacteria, lactobacilli, yeast like Saccharomyces. So a good mix of them. Again, if you have a specific condition, go for the one with evidence. If you don't, I think go for diversity and high numbers.
There's so much conflicting information out there. Are there any myths that you would like to debunk around probiotics and prebiotics?
I think some of the myths are, maybe they're not myths, they're kind of marketing tools, or products that promise to balance your microbiome, and things like that, where there's no such thing as balancing your microbiome. You wouldn't say you take a product to balance your brain. Balance sounds like a good word, and microbiome sounds like a good word. So you just put them together, and the inference is, oh, that must be good to balance your microbiome. I'd look for much more specific health claims. If there is a health claim, reduces this. Remember, food cannot be used to prevent, treat, or cure a disease. By law, it's not allowed to do those things. All it can do is reduce the risk. So risk reduction. There shouldn't be any kind of claim saying this will prevent, treat, or cure a disease, because that's illegal to do that. So look for ones that are, yeah, more pared back in their claim, but from the big manufacturers who only can put that on if they've really have the supporting evidence for that.
Now, microbiome testing
Mhm.
is becoming kind of popular. I presume there will be times when it is beneficial, but if you believed some of the information, it would seem that in the future, in the not too distant future, we'll all be testing our microbiome. Do you think that's a step too far? Do you think we should focus more on the basics, good essential basics, and we will benefit from that and have good microbiomes? Or do you think there is a benefit from knowing in a bit more detail what our microbiome is like and how we can improve it?
Yeah, I think that's the key. If you're doing it for curiosity value, if you're doing it like 23andMe, you can get your genetic profile, and you just because you're curious and you want to know more about yourself, then knock yourself out and get it done. But right now, I don't think there are any decisions that you can make based on your microbiome that will make sense. I know my microbiome because I've had it sequenced many times because I have to participate in different things we do in the lab. And I've never made a change based on that knowledge. Maybe in the future we will be making changes, but we're not there yet. So some of these companies, they'll do your microbiome and then they give you advice, which they say is based on your microbiome. But if you look at the advice, it's just general good advice. It's, eat more fiber, get more exercise. And you say, okay, I could have guessed all that without my microbiome. So at the moment, I think curiosity value, go for it. As a basis for making health decisions or dietary decisions, I don't think we're there yet.
So, based on what you know, what would be your a kind of some simple takeaway points from today? And also, if you feel comfortable What choices have you made for your own
Mm.
health based on what you know over the last 20 or 30 years of research?
I have made changes, and those changes are I make my own kombucha. I like kombucha. It's a kind of fermented tea. It's very easy to make at home. I eat lots of yogurt. I eat lots of fermented foods. I try to make sure that I've a high level of live microbes in my diet. I personally don't take any probiotics right now because I feel like I've got lots of live microbes in my diet, and I don't suffer from a condition, thankfully, where there's demonstrated benefit of probiotics. So if I did, I would certainly take them. I think, I try to practice again the Michael Pollan advice, eat food less and mostly plants. Obviously, you blowouts and so on, but try to eat a very plant-based diet. I'm not a vegetarian, but plants would dominate my diet. And then things like exercise. Um, I'm very wary of antibiotics. I will take them, of course, if I have an infection and if a clinician, but I will maybe pause and say, are we sure it isn't a viral infection? Because obviously antibiotics don't do anything for a viral infection. I will maybe stupidly kind of stick out an infection a bit longer before I would even look for advice. I recognize the value of antibiotics, of course, but unless they're absolutely necessary, I avoid things like antibiotics. And I try and eat a healthy diet. That's it. I know my microbiome is the one I deserve, and so I try to deserve a good one as far as I can.
I wanted to ask you maybe a little bit more looking into the future. And what do you believe our understanding, both now and emerging understanding of the microbiome, will mean for the future of medicine? Do you see medical practice changing over the next 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, I think it will. And I think it'll change in two directions. One is the clinicians' kind of mantra is first do no harm. So our clinicians doing things currently which harm the microbiome, but they're not taking that into their thinking at all because it's not on the standard list of, you would be very reluctant to give somebody something that damages their liver. But you will if it's, if you're giving someone cancer treatment or something, okay, it'll cause damage to the liver, but we know the benefit outweighs the risk. Will the microbiome begin to factor into decisions that clinicians will make to say, well, maybe we can treat this condition without causing damage to the microbiome, and we prefer to go that route. But also, I think microbiome screening, and I know I said a while ago that, your microbiome right now is just curiosity value, but I think we're going to go beyond that. There's been very good evidence, and I think this is amazing, that some people don't respond to certain medications. That's, again, well known in medical practice. Sometimes the average person might think, well, if you have a disease and you go on a drug, that drug will cure the disease because that's what the drug is designed to do. But you will know, as well others, that you very often get non-responders. You just get people who don't respond to a treatment that others do. And one big area is cancer treatment. And there's this wonderful new cancer therapies, checkpoint inhibitors that are immune inhibitors that help to treat cancer. But some people just don't respond to these checkpoint inhibitors. And what they've shown is if you take the microbiomes from people who respond to chemotherapy and people who don't respond, and you transfer those into mice, the mouse will now respond or not respond to the chemotherapy. And that's extraordinary because that might mean that your microbiome composition and makeup is influencing whether your anti-cancer treatment is working or not. Now, who would have put those two things together? Anti-cancer treatment and the microbiome. What's that got to do with? But they both involve the immune system. They involve priming the immune system and so on. So I think it'd be part of medical practice in a matter of years that somebody being put onto a chemotherapy or any kind of therapy or any kind of medication for which the microbiome has been shown to have a role will first be screened for, well, do we need to adjust your microbiome before we put you on chemotherapy? Do we need to maybe use antibiotics to change your microbiome or put you on a different diet or maybe even do a fecal microbiome transplant or choose a different medication based on your microbiome? That the microbiome will be used to almost guide people towards the most effective treatment. I think that will be the big change. And then there will be some drugs will come out of the microbiome. We will learned that the microbiome does something to affect human health, and we develop drugs based on that knowledge. So we have to accept now we have this extra organ. It's a microbial organ, but it's an organ, and therefore it plays a role in our health, and therefore it has to be considered in virtually every medical intervention.
What about engineered probiotics? My basic understanding would be companies are creating genetically modified bacteria for specific, maybe health outcomes.
Mm.
Exciting or concerning?
I'm a scientist, so it's incredibly exciting, and I'm thrilled by it, and I love it. Obviously, as a human being, I to stand back a little bit, but remember when gene therapy was being proposed first? I mean, there are a lot of people who are very against gene therapy. You're messing around with the genetic basis of humans, and but now, gene therapy for people with cystic fibrosis or different diseases, it's a life changer. And so again, come back as always to risk and benefit. Are there risks associated with genetic engineering? Yes, some of them are moral and ethical. We're interfering with the very fabric of life. Some of them are, are we able to predict what will happen if we genetically engineer an organism and kind of let it loose in the environment? And people can think of a post-apocalyptic kind of scenarios. Um, I think that in its place, genetically engineered microbes will play a role in human health. We're probably not there yet again, but yes, I think we will develop genetically engineered microbes, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. We should make sure it's very properly regulated and controlled, but to not take advantage of things that are at our disposal to improve human health, I think would be not the right way to go.
The latest thing I've heard about is postbiotics. This is a new term, maybe not new for you, obviously, but for I think the general public, probably a bit new. For those that haven't heard of it, what does that mean?
Postbiotics are, again, might sound paradoxical, but they are inactivated microbes, microbes that have been deliberately killed before being delivered to the body. As I said, most probiotics just simply pass through. So a postbiotic could potentially pass through, deliver the same potential benefits, but it's already dead. It cannot become part of your microbiome, even though that would be extraordinarily rare. It has benefits in terms of things like shelf life and ease and dosing and things like that because they're already inactive, so they're not going to grow again. It could mean at some point putting in microbes that would not be beneficial to us alive, but could have a benefit dead. Remember, your immune system, you know, acts by encountering molecules and reacting to those molecules. It doesn't ask, is this molecule being produced by a live bug or is it part of a dead bug? It doesn't ask that. We use, for example, inactivated microbes and viruses for vaccines. You deliver the inactivated virus, your immune system responds to it, and now you're protected against a live virus. Postbiotics is along the same kind of idea. Could inactivated microbes deliver some or maybe more of the benefits that live microbes do? So it's a very active area of research right now.
So I know another topic of interest for you is bacteriophages. Do you mind just giving us a little information on that?
Yeah, I talked a while ago about us. We live in a microbial world and it's dominated by bacteria and yeast and molds. But in fact, the most abundant biological entity on the planet are these bacteriophages. And they are bacterial viruses, viruses that do not affect us, they don't affect plants or animals, they only infect bacteria. And a single virus infects a single bacteria and bursts that bacteria and kills it. But in doing so, it multiplies. And so you might get 100 bacteriophages emerging from that burst bacteria, which then goes on and tries to infect neighboring bacteria. But they're very, very specific. They'll only infect, you know, a strain of bacteria and no others. So they don't just wipe out all bacteria, but they grow on their hosts, on their very selective hosts. And so in virtually every environment, in the sea, for example, there are lots of microbes, but there are 10 times as many of these bacteriophages as bacteria in the sea. And they help to carbon cycle, make sure the bacteria also kind of turn over and get destroyed and go back into the ecosystem. In our guts, we have about the same number of bacteriophages as bacteria, about that 10 to the 14 number. And what we're very interested in is that something that helps to shape the microbiome to guide microbiome function? And is it yet another way we can maybe manipulate the microbiome a little bit towards more positive health outcomes? Now, when they were first discovered 100 years ago, people immediately thought, oh, we can use these as antibiotics. If somebody's infected with salmonella, we could add a salmonella virus and wipe out the salmonella. And antibiotics were discovered soon afterwards, and they just took over. Ever except Russia. In Russia, they still use phages, and you can get them in pharmacies and use them to treat different infections. But the evidence for them isn't as compelling as we would like it to be. I think they work well in combination with antibiotics, but they're not an alternative to antibiotics, in my view. Some people think they can be. I'd be less convinced of that, but let's see where the evidence leads us.
Professor Hill, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I've learned so much. Thank you. Just as a final takeaway message, we usually just say if the speaker would like to just leave the listener with one final little take home message, what would that be?
I'll again cite Michael Pollan: eat less, mostly plants.
Love it. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Not at all.